So this story happened to my friend, who we'll call Ben for privacy reasons. Ben lives out of town, kind of in the middle of nowhere. He has a really big field and a farm. His mom always makes him feed the animals before he goes to bed. This one night he has some of his friends over. They all decide to sleep outside in the tent. As they were setting up the tent, it started to get dark. It was about 7 p.m. and the sun was starting to go down. As they get the tent up, they get comfortable and make sure the animals are fed before they just chill and talk about scary stories around the campfire. Ben and his friends decide to talk about scary stories, and they start talking about skinwalkers, wendigos, and a bunch of other mysterious creatures. As my friend starts talking about skinwalkers, the field that they're in goes completely silent. There's no wind, there are no animals making sounds, there's not even a single bug, almost like speaking the word skinwalker made the entire field and forest shut up. One of Ben's friends tells him just speaking of a skinwalker, or mentioning its name, can attracted them to you. Ben's kind of freaked out because when he mentioned skinwalker, everyone else started to hear stuff in the woods, like they were hearing footsteps and hearing tree branches snapping. One of Ben's friends said they thought they saw two eyes that were like 8 feet in the air, and when he looked to his friends, and then looked back, they were gone. The fire was dying down, and they swear they could hear whispering coming from the trees. One of Ben's friends wanted to be the brave man of the group, and he wanted to go into the trees to see what it was. Ben and some of the others told him not to because they didn't know what was going on and they were kind of freaking out. As the person who wanted to go into the woods to see what was going on stood up, he heard one of the most downright terrifying blood-crawling demonic screams. The person who wanted to go into the woods stopped in his tracks and turned around. His entire face was white, not just like snow, white like so white that it was so white that he thought he didn't have any skin, it was just bones. His entire body was that white. Ben and the others decided to go into the tent and try to get some sleep that night. They didn't want to stay up any longer to find out what was in those woods. It was around 3 a.m. Ben suddenly wakes up for seemingly no reason. Everyone else is asleep, but when Ben looks around to see what was going on and to figure out why he woke up, he had this weird feeling of being watched. The tent that him and his friend are sleeping in had no holes and no little pockets so you could peek out and see what was outside, but Ben swore he could hear something walking around the tent. It sounded like it was on 4 legs, but then it stopped. He could hear breathing beside him. He sleeps on the far end of the tent, right by the wall of the tent, so he's hearing this through the tent as he's inside of it. At this point, Ben is probably the most scared he's ever been, because everyone else is asleep except for him and it's pitch black outside. There are no lights, so he doesn't know what is going around the tent, but just as he wants to get up just to try to open the tent door a little bit to see what was going on, he heard this creature stand up on 2 legs and run to the front of the tent. The front of the tent is not see-through from the outside, but it is see-through from the inside. Ben describes this creature as a 8-foot-tall deer standing on 2 legs and is just bones and hair. He couldn't see the face, but he could see her claws. He could see something dripping off the claws, but he didn't know what it was. It terrified him. After what felt like an hour of staring straight, not blinking, just staring at the tent's door, the creature finally slowly walks away. As it's walking away, he can hear it say something he couldn't make out, but he swore it sounded like his mother saying, "Come inside, it's getting cold out." Ben did not fall asleep after that, he just stayed in the tent, lying awake. Eventually, the sun came back up, and Ben was the first one to walk out of the tent. When he walked out of the tent, he saw what looked like coyote footprints going around the tent, and they came from the forest. He also saw blood on the ground. The first thing that came to his mind when he saw that was the animals. He runs to check on the animals and he can see the chicken coop was torn open, and when he walked in, he felt sick to his stomach. The heads of the chickens were gone. The bodies were mutilated and the guts were everywhere. There were probably about 25 corpses of the chickens. Ben went back to the tent and woke up everyone. It took them a few minutes to get up. When they did, they went and took a look at the chickens. They threw up on the spot. My friend Ben never told them what he saw, but now Ben has never mentioned skinwalkers ever again. But every night for the past month, he has dreamt of that creature, looking at him through the tent and telling him to come outside, but he can hear that from every corner of the tent like there were more than one. My friend Ben is Christian, so he feels like the only reason why he is alive is because he believes that his guardian angel or God was protecting him that night, but he has never slept outside ever since that night. I still get chills when I think about the night I saw a skinwalker. It was a few years ago, and I was camping with some friends in a remote area of the Navajo Nation. We had picked a spot near a stream, set up our tents, and started a campfire. We were having a good time, telling stories, and roasting marshmallows. As it got later, we started to settle down for the night. I crawled into my tent and tried to get comfortable on my sleeping bag. I was just about to drift off when I heard a strange sound outside. It was a sort of growling, but it didn't sound like any animal I had ever heard before. I sat up and listened, trying to figure out what it could be. The growling got louder, and I started to feel uneasy. I heard a rustling outside my tent and realized something was moving around out there. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent flap. I shone the light outside and saw a figure standing a few yards away. It was tall and thin, with long arms and legs. Its skin was a sickly gray color, and its eyes glowed in the dark. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It looked like a person, but something was off. As I watched, the figure started to change. Its body twisted and contorted, and it began to shrink down. In a matter of seconds, it had transformed into a coyote. But it wasn't any ordinary coyote. Its eyes still glowed, and it seemed to be staring right at me. I was frozen with fear, not sure what to do. The coyote started to move closer to my tent, and I could hear its low growl again. I knew I had to get out of there, so I grabbed my backpack and scrambled out of the tent. I could hear my friends yelling, but I didn't stop to look back. I ran through the darkness, not knowing where I was going. The coyote was still following me, and I could hear it getting closer. I thought I was going to die. But then, I saw the glow of a fire in the distance. I ran towards it, hoping to find someone who could help me. As I got closer, I could see that it was a group of Navajo people. They were sitting around the fire, talking and laughing. I stumbled into their camp, gasping for breath. They looked at me with concern, and I managed to stammer out what had happened. One of the men nodded gravely and said, "You've seen a skinwalker." He explained to me that skinwalkers are Navajo witches who have the power to transform into animals. They are considered to be evil and dangerous, and it's believed that if you see one, it's a sign that something bad will happen to you. The Navajo people took care of me that night, letting me stay with them and keeping me safe. I never saw the skinwalker again, but I'll never forget that terrifying experience. Even now, when I go camping, I always make sure to check that my tent is securely zipped up before I go to sleep. I remember that night like it was yesterday. It was the summer of 2015, and I was camping alone in the deep woods of Montana. I had been looking forward to this trip for months, as I was a huge fan of the outdoors and loved the idea of being alone with my thoughts. However, what I experienced that night would change me forever. It was getting dark, and I had just finished setting up my tent when I heard something rustling in the bushes nearby. I assumed it was just a small animal and didn't think much of it. But then, I heard it again, and this time, it sounded bigger, almost like a person walking. That's when I saw it. A figure emerged from the woods, and at first, I thought it was just a person. But as it got closer, I could see that it was something else entirely. Its eyes glowed a bright red, and its skin was a sickly pale color. It walked on two legs, but it had the shape of an animal, with long, thin limbs and sharp claws. I knew what it was right away, a skinwalker. I had heard stories about them before, but I never thought I would come face to face with one. I froze, not knowing what to do. The skinwalker was getting closer, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I heard another sound. It was a low, guttural growl that seemed to be coming from all around me. I looked around, trying to find the source of the noise, but I couldn't see anything. It was then that I realized I wasn't alone. I was surrounded by a pack of Wendigos. They were creatures that were once human, but had been transformed by an evil spirit into cannibalistic monsters. They were known for their insatiable hunger for human flesh. I knew I had to get out of there, and fast. I grabbed my backpack and ran as fast as I could, with the skinwalker and Wendigos hot on my trail. I could feel their breath on the back of my neck, and I knew that one wrong move could mean the end for me. I don't know how long I ran for, but eventually, I stumbled upon a clearing. In the middle of the clearing was a small cabin, and I knew I had to get inside. I ran towards the cabin, and as I did, the skinwalker and Wendigos disappeared back into the woods. I spent the rest of the night in that cabin, huddled up in a corner, waiting for daylight to come. When morning finally arrived, I left the cabin and never looked back. I never went camping alone again after that night, and I still have nightmares about it to this day. I know what I saw that night, and I know that it was real. I wouldn't wish that experience on my worst enemy, and I hope that nobody else ever has to go through what I did. I've always been fascinated by Native American folklore, especially stories about skinwalkers and Wendigos. But I never thought I would encounter one myself, until that fateful night in the woods. It was a typical camping trip with my friends. We had set up our tents near a small creek and planned to spend the weekend hiking and enjoying nature. As the night fell, we gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling ghost stories. That's when we heard it. A strange noise in the distance, like the howl of a wild animal. We brushed it off as a coyote or a wolf, but the sound grew louder and more unsettling. Suddenly, one of my friends pointed to the tree line and screamed. There, standing in the shadows, was a figure unlike anything I had ever seen before. It was tall, with matted fur and antlers like a deer. Its eyes glowed red in the darkness, and it let out an ear-splitting shriek. We were frozen in terror, unable to move or even speak. But the creature didn't seem interested in us. It turned and ran into the woods, disappearing into the night. We spent the rest of the night huddled in our tents, too scared to venture outside. The next morning, we packed up and left the campsite, still shaken by the experience. I didn't know what to make of it at first. Was it a Wendigo? A skinwalker? Or just some kind of mutated animal? But as I researched more about Native American legends, I realized that what we had witnessed was something truly terrifying. I still have nightmares about that creature, and I'll never forget the feeling of pure terror that washed over me that night. I hope that I never encounter a skinwalker or a Wendigo again, but I know that the memory of that creature will haunt me for the rest of my life. I don't usually believe in supernatural things, but what happened to me a few months ago has made me reconsider my stance. I live in a small town in the northern United States, where winter lasts for a good 6 months out of the year. It's not uncommon to hear stories of skinwalkers or Wendigos in this area, but I never thought I'd actually encounter one. It was a typical winter evening, and I was walking home from work. The snow was falling heavily, and the wind was howling. I was bundled up in my winter coat, hat, and gloves, but I could still feel the cold seeping into my bones. As I trudged through the snow, I heard something moving behind me. At first, I thought it was just a stray dog or maybe a deer, but then I heard something that sounded like footsteps. I turned around, but I couldn't see anything in the snowstorm. I shrugged it off and kept walking, but the footsteps kept getting closer. I turned around again, and this time I saw a figure emerging from the snow. It was tall, thin, and had a deer skull for a head. I froze in terror as it approached me. It wasn't until later that I realized I had just encountered a Wendigo. The creature stared at me with empty eye sockets, and I could feel the chill of death emanating from it. I tried to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot. The Wendigo let out a blood-curdling scream, and I thought my eardrums were going to burst. I don't know how I managed to break free from its grip, but I ran as fast as I could, not daring to look back. I could hear its footsteps pounding behind me, and I knew it was gaining on me. I thought it was the end for me, but then I heard a gunshot. The Wendigo let out another scream and disappeared into the snowstorm. I turned around and saw a group of hunters emerging from the trees. They had been tracking the Wendigo and had come just in time to save me. I didn't stay to talk to them. I ran home and locked all my doors and windows. I didn't sleep that night, and I still have nightmares about the Wendigo's empty eye sockets and blood-curdling scream. Since that night, I don't go out after dark. I don't want to risk encountering another Skinwalker or Wendigo. It's a terrifying experience that I wouldn't wish on anyone. I'm not sure where to begin, but I guess I'll start by saying that I've always been interested in the paranormal. I've always found the idea of supernatural creatures and entities fascinating. That being said, what happened to me last year was nothing like anything I had ever read or heard about before. It was the middle of winter, and I was visiting my cousin in rural Minnesota. I had always heard stories about skinwalkers and Wendigos, but I never thought I'd actually encounter one. My cousin, who's lived in the area his whole life, warned me to be careful when I went out alone, especially at night. I didn't take his warning too seriously, but looking back, I wish I had. One night, I decided to go for a walk in the woods. It was a clear night, and the full moon illuminated the snowy landscape. Everything was silent except for the crunching of the snow under my boots. I felt at peace and completely unaware of the danger that lurked nearby. As I was walking, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a low growl, like that of an animal. At first, I thought it was just a wolf or a coyote, but the growling got louder and more aggressive. That's when I saw it. I can only describe it as a creature that looked like a mix between a wolf and a human. It was covered in fur and stood on its hind legs, like a person. But it had the head of a wolf, with glowing yellow eyes that seemed to pierce through me. Its teeth were bared, and it let out a bone-chilling howl. I was frozen in fear, unable to move or scream. The creature started to walk towards me, its eyes never leaving mine. I knew I was in danger, and I had to do something to protect myself. I tried to remember what I had read about skinwalkers and Wendigos, and I remembered that they were vulnerable to fire. I quickly pulled out my lighter and lit a branch that was lying on the ground. The flame flickered, and the creature backed away, as if it was afraid of the fire. I slowly backed away, keeping the flame between me and the creature. The growling turned into a low whine, and the creature eventually retreated into the woods. I ran back to my cousin's house as fast as I could, and I didn't stop until I was safe inside. I was shaking and out of breath, but I knew that I had just narrowly escaped a skinwalker or a Wendigo. I didn't sleep that night, and I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I never went back into the woods again, and I never spoke of what happened to anyone, until now. I know that what I saw was real, and I'll never forget the fear that I felt that night. I've learned to respect the unknown and to always be cautious, because you never know what might be lurking in the shadows. I've always been drawn to the supernatural, but after the encounter I had last summer, I wish I had stayed far away from it. I live in a rural area surrounded by forests, and it's not uncommon to hear stories about skinwalkers and wendigos lurking in the woods. But I never thought I'd come face to face with one. It was a warm summer night, and I was driving home from my friend's house. As I turned onto the dark and winding road that leads to my house, I felt a sudden chill. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I saw something in the distance. At first, I thought it was a deer, but as I got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. It was a tall, thin figure with antlers on its head, and its eyes seemed to glow in the darkness. It was hunched over, as if it was trying to hide behind the trees. I slowed down, unsure of what to do. That's when it turned its head and looked right at me. I could feel its gaze piercing through me, and I knew in that moment that I was in danger. I hit the gas pedal and sped away as fast as I could. But the creature wasn't going to let me go that easily. It chased after my car, keeping up with my speed effortlessly. It was almost like it was toying with me. I was in a panic, my heart racing as I tried to figure out how to escape. Then, I remembered something my grandmother had told me when I was younger. She said that if I ever encountered a skinwalker or wendigo, I should say a prayer and call upon the spirits to protect me. I had never believed her, but in that moment, I had nothing to lose. I closed my eyes and prayed as hard as I could, begging for protection. When I opened them again, the creature was gone. I breathed a sigh of relief and continued driving home, but the memory of that night still haunts me. I don't know if it was a skinwalker or a wendigo, but I do know that I never want to encounter it again. I don't venture into the woods anymore, and I always carry a charm that my grandmother gave me for protection. I survived that night, but I know that I was lucky. Others might not be so fortunate. I'm not sure where to begin with my story, but I feel like I need to share it with someone. I'm still shaking as I write this, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to shake the feeling of fear that now lives inside me. I was camping alone in the woods near my hometown, just trying to get away from the stress of everyday life. It was getting late, and I was settling in for the night when I heard something outside my tent. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was just an animal, but then I heard it again, and this time it sounded like footsteps. I froze, listening intently as the footsteps got closer and closer to my tent. I was too scared to move, and before I knew it, something was pushing against the fabric of my tent. I could hear its breath on the other side of the thin layer of fabric, and I knew that whatever it wasn't human. I heard a low growling noise, and then the sound of scratching as the creature tried to tear through the fabric of my tent. I was paralyzed with fear, but I knew that I had to do something if I wanted to survive the night. I grabbed my flashlight and my knife and slowly unzipped the tent. I poked my head out, trying to get a glimpse of whatever was out there. At first, I couldn't see anything, but then I caught a glimpse of something moving in the shadows. It was too dark to see clearly, but I could make out a shape. It was taller than any animal I had ever seen, and it moved in a way that was both familiar and unnatural. As it turned towards me, I saw its eyes reflecting the light from my flashlight. They were yellow, with a strange glow that seemed to come from within. I backed away slowly, trying to keep my eyes on the creature as it moved closer to me. I knew that I had to get out of there, but I couldn't leave my tent and all of my gear behind. As I was packing up my belongings, I could hear the creature circling around me, growling and snarling. I knew that I didn't have much time, so I grabbed everything I could and started running towards my car. I could feel the creature chasing me, and I knew that I had to keep moving if I wanted to survive. When I finally made it to my car, I looked back to see the creature standing just a few feet away from me. It was tall and thin, with skin that looked like it was stretched over bones. Its eyes were still glowing, and it let out a final growl before disappearing into the darkness. I don't know if it was a skinwalker or a Wendigo, but I do know that I never want to experience anything like that again. I've been camping in those woods for years, but I'll never forget the feeling of pure terror that I felt that night. I don't know if I'll ever be able to go back, but if I do, I'll be sure to bring some extra protection. I remember the day I saw it. The day my life was forever changed. It was a cold winter night, and I was driving back from a friend's house in the woods. The trees were barren and the air was still. It was quiet, too quiet. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a deer. But as I got closer, I realized that it was much larger than any deer I had ever seen. And it was standing on two legs. Its body was thin, emaciated even, and its eyes glowed a sinister red. It was a Wendigo. I froze in fear. I had heard stories of these creatures, and I knew what they were capable of. I wanted to run, but I was trapped in my car, unable to move. The Wendigo stared at me for what felt like an eternity, and then it started to move towards me. I was filled with a sense of dread as it got closer and closer. I could hear its breath, ragged and labored. I knew I was going to die. But then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the Wendigo stopped in its tracks. It looked up towards the sky, and then it disappeared. I sat in my car for a few minutes, trying to process what had just happened. When I finally composed myself, I started my car and drove away as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I was back in town. I never forgot that night, and I never went back to those woods again. But even now, years later, I can't help but feel like it's still out there, waiting for me. I remember the day my life changed forever. It was a cold winter evening, and I had just gotten off work. I was driving home on a lonely road in the middle of the woods when I saw something strange in the distance. At first, I thought it was a deer, but as I got closer, I realized it was something far more terrifying. It was a creature unlike anything I had ever seen before. Its body was thin and emaciated, its skin pale and almost translucent. Its eyes were black and soulless, and its limbs were unnaturally long and thin. It had the shape of a human, but there was no mistaking what I was seeing. It was a skinwalker. I tried to turn around and drive away, but my car wouldn't start. Panic set in as the creature started to move towards me, its long limbs moving in a way that defied all logic. I was trapped, alone in the woods with this terrifying monster. As it got closer, I could hear its raspy breaths and the sound of its bones cracking as it moved. I was frozen with fear, unable to move or scream as it approached me. I could feel its cold breath on my neck as it leaned in close, its black eyes staring deep into my soul. Just as I thought it was going to attack, it suddenly stopped and let out a bone-chilling scream. It turned and disappeared into the woods, leaving me alone and trembling with fear. I managed to get my car started and drove away as fast as I could, not daring to look back. When I got home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I stayed up all night, staring out the window, convinced that the skinwalker would come back for me. In the days and weeks that followed, I couldn't get the experience out of my head. I researched skinwalkers and discovered that they were evil creatures capable of shape-shifting into any animal or human form. I learned that encountering one was a rare and terrifying experience, and that most people who did never lived to tell the tale. But I did survive, and although I'm haunted by the memory of that night, I know that I'm one of the lucky ones. I'll never forget the fear and helplessness I felt that night, and I'll always be on the lookout for any sign of the supernatural. But for now, I'm just grateful to be alive and to have a chance to tell my story. I'm not one to believe in superstitions or legends, but what I saw that night still haunts me to this day. It was just like any other camping trip. My friends and I had planned for weeks, excited to spend the weekend in the wilderness, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. Little did we know that we would encounter something beyond our wildest nightmares. It was the second night of our trip when we started to hear strange noises in the woods around us. At first, we brushed it off as just the wind or some small animals rustling through the leaves. But as the night progressed, the noises grew louder and more sinister. We could hear branches snapping and footsteps coming closer and closer to our campsite. That's when we saw it. A creature unlike anything we had ever seen before emerged from the trees. Its eyes glowed like fire, and its body was twisted and contorted in ways that no human or animal should be able to do. It moved towards us, with a slow and deliberate gait, as if it was sizing us up. We were frozen in fear, unsure of what to do. It was then that I remembered the stories I had heard about skinwalkers and wendigos, creatures from Native American legends that could take on the form of animals or humans, and were known for their malevolent intentions. We all huddled together, hoping that the creature would go away. But it didn't. It just stood there, watching us with its glowing eyes. It wasn't until dawn broke that it finally disappeared back into the woods. We packed up our things and left the campsite immediately. We didn't talk about what had happened until we were safely back in civilization. But even now, years later, I still have nightmares about that night. I can still hear the crunching of leaves under its feet, and see the glow of its eyes in the darkness. I don't know what that creature was, but I do know that it was something beyond our understanding. And I hope that I never have to encounter it again. I never believed in skinwalkers or wendigos, at least not until I had my own encounter. It happened when I was camping alone in the woods, far away from civilization. It was late at night, and I was sitting by the campfire, roasting marshmallows. That's when I heard a strange noise coming from the woods. It was like a low growl, and it sent shivers down my spine. I thought it might be a bear or a coyote, so I grabbed my flashlight and went to investigate. As I walked deeper into the woods, the growling got louder, and I began to feel uneasy. I shone my flashlight around, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was making the noise. That's when I saw it. A dark figure, walking on two legs, with glowing eyes. At first, I thought it might be a person, but as it got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. Its limbs were elongated and twisted, and its skin was mottled and gray. I could feel my heart racing as it approached me, and I knew I had to get out of there. I turned and ran back to my campsite as fast as I could, feeling the thing chasing me every step of the way. When I got to my tent, I quickly zipped it shut and held my breath, listening for any sound of it outside. For hours, I lay there, too afraid to move or make a sound. But eventually, the growling stopped, and I knew it had gone. When the sun finally rose, I packed up my campsite and left, never looking back. To this day, I'm not sure what I saw that night. But I know it wasn't human. And I'll never forget the feeling of being hunted by something so dark and malevolent. I never believed in supernatural beings or creatures until that fateful day when I encountered a skinwalker. I was on a camping trip with my friends in the woods of Arizona. We had a great time hiking and roasting marshmallows over the campfire, but things started to get weird as the night went on. It was almost midnight when we heard strange noises coming from the woods. At first, we thought it was just an animal, but the noises sounded too human-like. We all huddled around the fire, trying to calm our nerves, but the noises grew louder and closer. Suddenly, we saw a figure emerging from the woods. It was tall and skinny, with long arms and legs that seemed to move in an unnatural way. Its eyes were glowing in the dark, and its face was twisted in a sinister grin. We froze in terror, not knowing what to do. The creature started to move towards us, and we could hear its bones cracking with each step. It was then that I realized we were in the presence of a skinwalker, a creature that can transform into any animal it wants. I don't know how we managed to escape, but we ran as fast as we could back to our car. We drove off, leaving everything behind, including our tents and gear. We didn't speak a word until we were miles away from the woods. To this day, I still have nightmares about that creature. I know it sounds crazy, but I swear it was real. If you ever find yourself camping in the woods, be careful. You never know what's lurking in the darkness, waiting to prey on unsuspecting victims like us. I've always been fascinated by Native American legends and folklore, especially those involving skinwalkers and Wendigos. But my interest turned to terror one night when I had my own encounter with one of these creatures. I was camping with a group of friends in a remote forest in the Pacific Northwest. We were deep in the woods, miles away from any town or city, and the only light came from our campfire. We were telling ghost stories and laughing, but the mood changed when I noticed movement in the trees beyond the clearing. At first, I thought it was just an animal, but as it got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. It was humanoid, but it moved with an unnatural gait, almost like it was limping. It was tall, towering over the trees, and its skin was a sickly grayish-white. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me. I didn't want to alarm my friends, so I tried to play it cool, but I could feel the fear rising inside me. I couldn't take my eyes off it. It circled our campsite, staying just out of reach of the firelight. Every time it passed behind a tree, my heart would skip a beat, afraid that it would leap out at us. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, it disappeared back into the forest. We didn't speak about it that night, but I could tell my friends had seen it too. We packed up our camp as soon as the sun came up and didn't stop until we were miles away from that forest. I later learned that the area we were camping in was known for sightings of both skinwalkers and Wendigos. Some believe that they are the same creature, while others believe they are different entities altogether. Regardless of what it was, I'll never forget that feeling of pure terror as it circled our campsite, watching us with those cold, unfeeling eyes. I don't know what it wanted, or why it chose to reveal itself to us that night. But I do know one thing, I never want to see it again. I've always been fascinated by Native American legends and the supernatural entities that they warn about. Growing up in the rural Midwest, I had heard stories of skinwalkers and Wendigos, but I never thought I would actually encounter one. It was a chilly autumn evening, and I was driving home from a late shift at work. The road was deserted, and the only sounds were the crickets chirping in the distance. I was about halfway home when I saw something moving in the woods to my left. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a coyote. But as I got closer, I realized that it was something much more sinister. It was tall, with long arms and legs, and its eyes glowed in the darkness. Its body was covered in matted fur, and it moved with an unnerving grace. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead as I realized that I was staring at a Wendigo. I had heard stories of these malevolent creatures that possessed humans and drove them to madness and cannibalism. I had always thought they were just myths, but here was one, right in front of me. I tried to speed up and get away from it, but it kept pace with my car, its eyes fixed on me. It felt like an eternity before I finally saw the lights of my house in the distance. I pulled into the driveway and ran inside, locking the door behind me. For hours, I sat there in the dark, listening for any sign of the Wendigo outside. I was convinced that it was going to break in and kill me, or worse, possess me and drive me to madness. But eventually, the sun started to rise, and the woods fell silent. Looking back on that night, I still don't know if what I saw was real or just my imagination playing tricks on me. But every time I drive down that road, I can't help but feel a shiver run down my spine, and I always keep an eye out for any sign of the Wendigo lurking in the darkness. I remember that night like it was yesterday, even though it's been years. I was driving home from a late shift at work, taking the back roads to avoid traffic. It was a quiet, starry night and the moon was full. I was enjoying the peaceful drive until I saw something that made my heart race. Up ahead on the road, I saw a dark figure walking on two legs. It was tall and lanky, with long arms and legs that seemed to stretch out unnaturally. It looked almost like a human, but its movements were jerky and erratic. I slowed down, trying to get a better look. As I got closer, the figure turned to face me, and that's when I saw its face. It was twisted and distorted, with sharp teeth and glowing eyes. I could feel my blood turn to ice in my veins. I knew right then and there that this was no ordinary person. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to turn around and drive as fast as I could in the opposite direction, but another part of me was curious. I had heard stories of skinwalkers and wendigos before, but I never thought I would encounter one myself. The figure started moving towards my car, and that's when I hit the gas. I didn't look back until I was miles away, safe in my own home. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in my bones. I never talked about what I saw to anyone. I didn't want to sound crazy or paranoid. But sometimes, when I'm driving down those back roads again, I can't help but wonder if that creature is still out there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for its next victim. I'm not one to easily believe in supernatural creatures or urban legends. But one particular encounter I had will forever haunt me. I was out camping in the woods, enjoying the peace and quiet away from the hustle and bustle of the city. On the third night, I woke up to the sound of something moving around outside my tent. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but the sounds were different. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just my imagination, but the sounds grew closer and louder. I decided to take a peek outside my tent. As I unzipped the flap, I felt a chill run down my spine. In the moonlight, I saw a figure standing near the edge of the woods. It was tall, slender, and had a deer skull for a head. Its eyes glowed a bright red, and it was staring right at me. My heart raced as I realized what I was looking at, a Wendigo. I had heard stories of this creature before, but I never believed them to be true. The Wendigo was said to be a malevolent spirit that possessed humans and turned them into cannibalistic monsters. I quickly zipped up my tent and sat there, paralyzed with fear. I could hear the Wendigo circling around my tent, scratching at the fabric. It was like it was taunting me, trying to lure me out of my safe haven. The sounds continued for what felt like hours, but eventually, they stopped. I stayed put in my tent, too afraid to move or even breathe. It wasn't until morning that I mustered up the courage to leave my tent and investigate. To my relief, there was no sign of the Wendigo. But the memory of that night still sends shivers down my spine. I now believe in the existence of supernatural creatures and always make sure to be fully prepared when I venture into the woods. You never know what kind of horrors may be lurking in the darkness. I'm not sure if what I saw that night was a skinwalker or a Wendigo, but I know it wasn't human. It was a few years ago, and I was camping in a remote part of the woods with my friends. We had picked a spot far away from civilization, where we could enjoy the peace and quiet of nature without any interruptions. We set up our tents, started a campfire, and cracked open some beers. It was the perfect night, until we heard something rustling in the bushes. At first, we thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a bear. But then we heard a strange howling noise, unlike anything we had ever heard before. We all froze, listening intently. That's when we saw it. It was standing on two legs, hunched over, and covered in fur. Its eyes were glowing, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque snarl. We all knew that we were in serious trouble. We tried to run, but it was too fast. It was like it was toying with us, chasing us through the woods, always staying just out of reach. Every time we thought we had lost it, it would reappear, closer and closer. We were running on pure adrenaline, our hearts pounding in our chests, our breaths coming in short gasps. We finally made it back to our campsite, but it was too late. The creature was already there, waiting for us. It stood on the edge of the clearing, its eyes fixed on us. We huddled together, trying to think of a way out. But there was nowhere to go. We were trapped. That's when it started to speak. It spoke in a voice that was both human and inhuman at the same time, a voice that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. It told us that we were trespassing on its territory, and that we needed to leave. It warned us that if we ever came back, it would not be so forgiving. We didn't need to be told twice. We packed up our gear and left as quickly as we could, running through the woods until we reached our car. We didn't speak a word the entire way back, each of us lost in our own thoughts. To this day, I'm not sure what we saw that night. All I know is that it was something beyond our understanding, something that should never be encountered. I'm just grateful that we made it out alive, and that I can share this story as a warning to others. If you ever find yourself in the woods, be careful. You never know what's out there, waiting for you. I'm a hunter, and I've spent most of my life in the wilderness. I've seen all kinds of strange things out there, but nothing quite like what I saw a few years ago. I was hunting elk in the mountains of Wyoming, and I'd been out all day without much luck. It was getting late, and I was about to head back to camp when I heard something behind me. At first, I thought it was just an animal, but then I heard the sound of footsteps. I turned around, and that's when I saw it. It was a tall, skinny creature with long arms and legs, and its skin was gray and mottled. Its eyes were black and empty, and it had a twisted, almost human-like face. It was a Wendigo. I froze, and the Wendigo just stood there, staring at me. I knew that I was in danger, but I didn't know what to do. I'd heard stories about Wendigos before, but I'd never actually seen one. I slowly reached for my gun, but the Wendigo moved so fast that I didn't have time to aim. It lunged at me, and I stumbled backwards, falling to the ground. The Wendigo was on top of me, and I could feel its cold breath on my face. I don't know how I managed to do it, but I somehow pushed the Wendigo off of me and scrambled to my feet. I ran as fast as I could back to my camp, and I didn't stop until I was safely inside my tent. For the rest of the night, I heard the Wendigo outside my tent, howling and scratching at the fabric. I didn't sleep at all that night, and I was terrified that the Wendigo would come back for me. The next day, I packed up my things and left the mountains. I never went back there again, and I never want to see a Wendigo again. I still have nightmares about that night, and I know that I'm lucky to have survived. I remember the night like it was yesterday, even though it happened over a decade ago. I was out camping with some friends in the deep woods of northern Michigan. It was a beautiful night, with the full moon shining bright overhead. We had a roaring campfire going and were telling ghost stories to scare each other. That's when we heard it, a low growling sound coming from the woods. We all froze, unsure of what to do. Then we heard footsteps, heavy and slow, coming closer and closer to our campsite. My friends and I grabbed our flashlights and shined them towards the sound. That's when we saw it, a creature like I had never seen before. Its body was thin and bony, and its eyes glowed bright red in the darkness. It looked like a mix between a wolf and a human, but there was something off about it. We all knew what it was, a skinwalker. We had heard the stories growing up, but never in a million years did we think we would come face to face with one. We tried to run, but the creature was faster than us. It was almost like it was toying with us, letting us think we had a chance to escape. We could hear it laughing, a sound that still haunts me to this day. Eventually, we stumbled upon an old abandoned cabin. We quickly locked the door and barricaded ourselves inside. The creature clawed at the door, trying to get in, but we were safe for the time being. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, too scared to move. Every little sound made us jump, and we prayed that the creature wouldn't find a way in. When the sun finally rose, the creature was gone. We quickly packed up our camp and left, never wanting to return to that place again. I don't know what would have happened to us if we hadn't found that cabin. I shudder to think about it. But one thing's for sure, I'll never forget that night and the terror that came with it.